that stuff from podcasts. So about 55% you can see of people in this country are listening to have listened to podcasts ever in the last month. That's the ever is the darker square or rectangle, but still it's, you know, and it's on the move, as you can see. Obviously the numbers are going up. I mean, that's in part because you know, corporate America is seeing it as a money-making proposition. But you know, there's a ton of independent podcasters out there too, and it's a real opportunity for us to sort of do our work through this medium. You know, if you can go to the next slide, you can see a lot of different genres. And so really one of the top genres is comedy. People are looking to podcasts for entertainment, but not too far down is society and culture. And that's in a way kind of where we end up being kind of put, although sometimes some of our work is not health and fitness, but it's health related. But you know, there's definitely hunger for information about that has a sociological perspective. Okay, next. So why even bother to do a podcast? Well, you're passionate about the issues that you are working on, often reflective of your theoretical or research knowledge. You want to reach a broader audience. You want to build community amongst the people who are listening. And depending on the kind of podcast that you're doing, you may want to provide support. So we have a lot to give. We know a lot. We can support our listeners, and we can also challenge people's thinking. So I want to talk about the different formats. So people said they've listened to podcasts, and I guess, I don't know if there's space. Can we see the chat? And people can write down like a couple of your favorite podcasts. I'm not sure if I'm able to see that, but maybe Trenton and Sella, you can see it. Do you want to just take one moment and write down maybe 2 of your favorite podcasts? Okay, Hidden Brain from Melissa. Heather Hurwitz, Renee Brown, Amicus. These are coming from Myths and Legends. I'm not going to say your name, sorry, because they're coming fast. That's from Paulina. Have a second. Dear Hank and John, Pod Save America. A few more, got a few more, or that's American Refugee, In Our Times, Strict Scrutiny, Stuff You Should Know, Ear Hustle, Be Authentic, This American Life. Okay, so you're wrong about, I'm going to stop right there, but so there's a full range. I don't know if you could get a sense of that, but you know, a lot of the podcasts that we listen to are interview based. So that means that there's a host and the host is interviewing one or more people. That's pretty typical. And so as qualitative researchers or as quantitative researchers who use qualitative methods too, this is sort of like our home base. A narrative podcast is something different. It's something that I do. It's basically, as I think of it as a qualitative researcher, I think of it as it's a scripted, it's almost like writing a qualitative report. You know, I look at the interview transcript, I find, you know, quotes, but in my world of podcasting, they're called hot tape. And I pull out quotes and I put them aside, and then I write a script that uses my voice as the host to kind of weave things together. So unlike a qualitative research report where you actually might, you know, you would be the analyst, the person who sums everything up. I would, you know, in a narrative podcast, there's probably a little less analysis, but a lot of, you know, reflection and bringing in other information to contextualize. Okay, magazine format, if you think of 60 Minutes, but for audio, you know, that would be a podcast that has, oops, we're not quite moving yet. Yeah, that would be a podcast that has different segments. So maybe an interview segment, maybe a segment where, you know, wise words from a sociologist, you know, on a regular basis, or there might be you know, the host framing the discussion and doing an analysis up front or something like that. Banter. There's a very popular podcast format in which 2 people just kind of shoot the whatever. And so that, and I often find those podcasts don't necessarily go in depth into issues, but they can. And then there's the solo podcast. That's, you know, somebody who chooses to just talk. And there are people who do that. You know, you have something that you really want to say, and you know, these are all legitimate. There's no judgy thing going on here. It's just really what you want to do and what your resources are. So, okay, shall we move? Okay, how do you build a podcast? Well, the most important thing is to develop your idea. You know, think about what are the themes of what you want to share. Is there an arc to your podcast? I find an arc seems to be more common when you have a narrative podcast or a storytelling podcast, you know, something like Serial, where, you know, it's a story that goes from beginning to end. I know that what I work on as a narrative podcast does attempt to have an arc. And maybe interview-based podcasts have an arc, but they may be less visible. What format will be used? Are you going to use in terms of, you know, are you the host? Do you have a couple of hosts? If you have more than one host, you need to make sure that you work well together. You know, that things go smoothly and that you have a rapport, because that sets the stage and the tone for everything. Guests, if you're going to have guests, generally you're probably pre-interviewing people, or that's something that not everybody does, but it is often done, just to get a sense of what your guest can offer you. In some cases, if you know somebody's work and you have a relationship with them and you're just bringing a friend or a colleague on, maybe that's not even necessary. And then, you know, scripted versus non-scripted. You know, if you're doing an interview, you probably want, you know, questions as a guide. As a scripted thing for narrative, you know, there really is a script that it gets recorded, is followed, that incorporates the hot tape and your narration. How often should you drop an episode? It depends on your energy and time, but generally people go for weekly. Whatever it is, it should be consistent, same time, same day, every time it's dropped. You know, whether it's weekly, bi-weekly, or whatever, because people build an expectation that that's when it's going to come out. What makes your podcast unique? That's just a question that I think that anybody starting a podcast should consider. I know that you know, for me in the world of caregiving, I had to look and see, you know, had anybody done this before? How would mine be different, and so on. And I think that the market is a little bit glutted, and so you really want to consider how you can contribute something that is unique and to your listeners. Okay, ready? Okay, finances. Good luck. A lot of people do it on the cheap, and I think you'll hear from some of our speakers who have figured out some really creative ways to not have to spend a bunch of money. Yes, Ella? Oh, 5 minutes, thank you. Okay, thanks. Some people try and raise money. I'm in the process of doing that right now. People raise money through listener donations. Something like PayPal can get you one-time money. Patreon, if you have a listenership, goes after sustaining members, so you can have money that comes in on a regular basis, on a monthly basis. Some people try and go after grants. It's really hard to find grant money for podcasting. Sponsors, that's pretty common. To find an organization or a company or whatever that you can, if you can live with that, in which their interests are aligned with yours. And advertisers, you can sell ads if you want. P.S. at the bottom, you won't get rich creating a podcast. So surprise, surprise. Okay, next slide, please. Hosting platforms. So, you know, once you have created a podcast, you need to be able to get it out there. Oops, high level grant stuff. Seems like a podcast could be helpful for, okay. So Melissa, hold on to that question, okay? Because that's something that we'd like to hear about. So wherever you post your podcast, it's called a hosting platform, and it then uploads at the same time to apps that you've signed up with. So ready for the next one? So a hosting platform Oh, sorry, I didn't actually put this in here. A hosting platform, the one I use is called Simplecast. Um, there are many different ones. Lip Sync, of course, I'm not going to remember them all at the moment, but other people will share that with you. But what they essentially do is they push out your episodes onto apps that you've already submitted and been accepted to. So Apple is kind of considered the most complicated. People get their podcast accepted by them, but it might take 1 week or 2 weeks. The others are simple. It could be literally like 3 hours. Okay, next, please. Recording. I'm going to, so let me know when I have 2 minutes, okay? So post-pandemic, people often use recording studios, but you don't have to. You can still do DIY. So DIY, 2 minutes. Okay. So the goal is for us to make sound as good as possible and minimize echo. Often people buy an inexpensive mic. People record their podcasts in closets. They make forts. They use fabric to cover windows, anything to cut down on the ambient sound. It can be a problem. Okay, next, please. Post-pandemic, here's a recorder that people have suggested that you purchase, Zoom H4n. You can get them used for about $100 from what I've seen. A lot of people now are using Zoom. It has good quality sound. You can see who you're interviewing, even though you're creating an audio product, and it will record on multiple tracks. But at the same time, it's important to have backup. And I've done this a bunch, using voice memo to record your voice, and your interviewee uses voice memo to record their voice. So you have a backup in case anything messes up. I'm not going to go into how to do it. We could talk about that later if you want. Okay, can we have the next one, please? Oh yeah, right. These are editing your episodes. You can do that by yourself in Audacity, which is free. Hindenburg, not free. It allows you to cut chunks of audio and put them together. Or you can hire a professional editor if you don't have the time, if you don't want to learn this thing, and if you have the resources. Okay, next, please. Logo and music. So it's really important to have a great logo. It is what your audience or your possible listener group first sees when they're looking for a podcast. It needs to stand out, has to have the name of the podcast in it. And if it's too busy, it will be hard to read. So think of it, and people are gonna be looking on their phones. If you wanna do a logo on your own, you can do it yourself on Canva. I've never tried. Or if you can find a graphic designer, which I think is a great idea to create a logo, I would go for that. Music. Music's great. Everybody needs to have music in their podcast, in my humble opinion. I think we have one more slide, if I am right. And I would say let's skip this one because we don't have time. Building an audience. Social media, friends tell friends, get feedback from people, create a Facebook group, shout outs to people when they write you, press. Writing a newsletter is a big deal. People do that a lot, and I've kind of hesitantly but finally gotten into doing that, where people get to hear a little bit more about what you're doing, get the behind the scenes story, and you can also ask for money, and then take advantage of your resources. Cross promos with other podcasts and getting guests who have good networks, as long as they're people who are going to offer something to the podcast. And are we almost done? I think we're close. Okay, last slide. I know it seems like a lot, but it's worth it to have a website. So everybody who is potentially going to listen, or the listeners look for it, you can include your audio as well as show notes, which is the language that people use for bios for the guests, the blog, additional resources. It becomes something that people look forward to seeing, and then they can go to, it's like a one-stop shop. They can go back to your website to get all your episodes, or they can obviously go to Apple or Stitcher or whatever. So that's it for now. I know that was a lot and a lot fast. But we are ready to move to the next. And you probably have questions, so hold on to questions. And when you get into your small groups, that's something that you can also bring up. All right. So our first speaker is Celeste Graham. Celeste is currently a doctoral student in sociology at Texas Women's University in Denton, Texas. Her research interests include adaptation experiences of formerly incarcerated Black mothers and experiences with colorism amongst college-educated Black women. She has a bachelor's degree in history, a master's degree in women's and gender studies from University of North Texas. She has taught at University of North Texas in the Women and Gender Studies Department. She's taught middle school, high school, Dallas-Fort Worth area. She has a lot of experience like working in interesting jobs. And so over the past 3 years, she's developed a podcast called The Celeste Show that explores dismantling of white supremacist ideas and institutions and the intersectional issues that Black women encounter. And more recently, she's dedicated her podcast to discussing the complex issues of colorism. And she's mother to a toddler girl, and she's a PhD student. Did I say that? I said that up front. Oh, yes, I did. In third year? Are you in your third year?
Yes, I'll be starting my dissertation probably at the tail end of this semester. So
okay, excellent. So I'm going to also introduce Christina, because the two of you will be introducing one another. So we'll do the bios up front, okay? So Christina is a PhD student in sociology at University of Pittsburgh, studying the development of Asian American folks in the 1960s through the 1980s through an in-depth case study of New York City's basement workshop. That's intriguing. Her research interests span topics related to diaspora, racial justice, and transnational feminisms. In her spare time, Christina produces and hosts her podcast, Seats at the Table, elevating the perspectives of activist and immigrant women. Okay, so I'm going to leave it to you and leave this part.
Thanks, Mindy, for the intro. And thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm on the West Coast, so this was early morning for me. So if you're on a different time zone than the East Coast, thanks for waking up with me. So I'm going to be interviewing Celeste first about her podcast and sort of her process. And then, as Mindy said, Celeste is going to switch and interview me about my podcast. So first, Celeste, I'm so excited to hear more about your podcast because we both actually started ours the same year. So just for the audience, can you first introduce your podcast and then play the little clip that you have prepared as well?
Hey, yeah, good morning, everybody. I'm Celeste Graham. My podcast is called The Celeste Show. Celeste is a play on my name. I'm also a personal stylist, so I do a lot with clothing, styling people like conceptually and just personal styling. So I created this name for my show based off of like just my friends being like, oh, you always slang, you always have on something cute. And that's where it came from because my name is Celeste Graham. So I changed it to Celeste. But my podcast is dedicated and has been since its conception of just kind of like discussing intersectional feminist issues that women face. And then I spent some time talking about and critiquing capitalism. I spent some time just kind of like incorporating different elements of pop culture. And more recently, in the past year or so, I've really delved back into talking about colorism, which is one of the things that I've chiefly been interested in probably for like the past decade or so. I recently released a podcast on Tuesday about protecting Black women who live their lives in public spaces. So just after seeing some different things about online that were just kind of really intriguing to me in regard to the way that the public has responded to Stacey Abrams, to Kamala Harris, to Ayanna Pressley, to Megan Thee Stallion with the domestic violence issue that she experienced this summer. So I recorded this podcast just to kind of really stress the importance of doing that. And I'm going to play you guys a little bit of a clip. I'm going to play you about 1 minute and 30 seconds of the podcast. Share my screen out with you guys. Give me 1 second. Share my sound. Okay. All right. Past week or so about the need for us to talk about protecting Black women and talk about protecting Black women specifically who live their lives very publicly in public places, politicians, celebrities, so on and so forth. Just in general, the intersection between gender and race and the way that it works has often been one of the chief ways and chief interests I've had in wanting to go into academia and wanting to pursue scholarly endeavors and wanting to write and research and really explore the dynamic, because that's absolutely something that affects the way that I live. It's going to affect the way that my daughter lives and experiences the world. You know, affects the way that we're perceived by others who are not like us, who are like us. Just in general, I feel really excited about the fact that Kamala Harris is about to be sworn in as the first woman, Black woman, South Asian woman, vice president of the United States. It's such a powerful position to have. I am concerned about the ways in which Black women and girls are going to be attacked because of her position. Not that I think that she should in any way shy away from what she has rightfully earned and what is rightfully her position and what she is, I honestly think is going to hopefully, you know, we'll see, hopefully excel at her and you know, President-elect Joe Biden. I'm not just say President Biden, because that's what he's about to be. You know, if there's not another insurrection, God, we'll talk about that too. But it's really interesting to me seeing her come into this dynamic and step into this dynamic, and what that's going to mean for Black women and girls. I mean, we saw this with Michelle.
Okay. Thanks for sharing that clip, Celeste. And it's very fitting considering what just happened yesterday, which was a sigh of relief, I think, for a lot of people. Can you talk a little bit about sort of like how you came up with the idea for this podcast, especially because you have so many interests and so many life experiences with your work? How did you create the podcast and decide what route to take in terms of the topics that you choose to discuss?
Yeah, so I initially started the podcast. I had planned to start the podcast in the summer of 2017. And so I was just kind of like gauging different studios here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area that I could potentially hire on to do some editing and to record at. And I started the podcast because I knew that eventually I was going to apply for a PhD program. I had been living in South Dallas. I had been working with a population of women who had gotten out of prison and were navigating freedom again and navigating ways that they could mother and live their lives with dignity as Black women. And I don't know how much you guys know about South Dallas, but it's a very rich, culturally rich area of Dallas, a very historically important area. And I started the podcast just to kind of explore what I really wanted to do once I entered into a PhD program and what I wanted to talk about. And it's been a really cathartic experience for me, just being able to get my ideas out in a very quick way, as opposed to writing them out like on a blog or something of that nature.
Great, thanks. And I also feel the same way about podcasting for myself too. We spend so much of our time writing and thinking about writing. This is sort of a different way to get our points across. Something that really strikes me about your work is that it so closely aligns to your dissertation research or your planned dissertation research. But I think that as sociologists in training, it can be hard to sort of push our own sort of activist ideals and as we're also doing our research. So I'm curious how you choose to incorporate these themes of social justice and social activism in your podcasting work and how closely that aligns with the work that you do in your prospective dissertation work.
Yeah, sure. So I always think about this question anytime that I approach academic work, anytime I approach social justice. First and foremost, I'm an activist. That's what I consider myself to be. I'm an activist in different fronts, you know, both academically, within public spaces, and I have been for almost 12 years now. And when I decided to enter into academia once again, like my second round of graduate school, that was really important to me. I think that academics absolutely have a responsibility to be activists first and foremost, because I just don't think it's a fruitful endeavor for us to produce research and produce writing that is very important, that, you know, in many ways serves as a basis for policy and for change, and to not be deeply indebted and, you know, have a real responsibility to want to do activist work and to want to better and strengthen our communities. And so when I decided to, you know, I'm a Black woman, and I think that that informs so much of who I am. When I get a PhD, it's not just a PhD for me, it's a PhD for my daughter to grow up knowing that her mother, when she was 4 months old, decided to go forth and get a PhD, sleep deprived, working full time, decided to, you know, do that because I really feel that I have a responsibility to show my daughter that she deserves to take up as much space as she wants to in this world, that she deserves the very best, that she's capable of getting the very best. And also, I just feel I have a deep love for people, a deep love of community, and I feel that the work that I'm doing can and will serve a greater purpose as far as dismantling some of the systemic barriers that formerly incarcerated people, and especially Black mothers, face in trying to reacclimate to freedom.
Thanks, Celeste. In the clip that you played, it was you sort of reflecting on the ways that Black women are in the public eye and held to different sorts of expectations, and the ways that we, especially you as a Black woman and a Black mother, have to consider about how to protect yourself and other Black women and future Black women. How do you think people hearing that respond? Like, is the attendant audience for your work other Black women or people who are allies to Black women? Like, how do you think about the audience for the work that you're producing?
I've always known that because I am talking about academic ideas, intersectional feminism, you know, critiques of capitalism, that a lot of people are going to not necessarily be engaged with that conversation. And so one of the things I have wanted to do in choosing the specific medium of podcasting is to make it more accessible to people. I absolutely am podcasting for other Black women and for women and for allies of Black women and Black people. I'm podcasting for those who are interested in how to engage with social justice, who are interested in creating, you know, more equitable communities. I would say that's my primary audience. I have not, fortunately, because I really don't want to even have to deal with the trauma of people who do not agree with those types of ideas and who do not see life through that lens, coming into my you know, my platform, into my space, and refuting the things that I'm saying. I am absolutely just completely dedicated to producing bodies of work that will help people in their quest to make a more equal world.
And just sort of as a last question, since we had to wrap up, since you are a third-year graduate student, and I also am a graduate student, how do you, I think this is also advice for myself, how do you balance producing a podcast, your coursework, being a mother, and just the other responsibilities that you have in your life, especially since some of our audience members are thinking about producing their own?
I wish it didn't have to be this way all the time, but I run a tight ship. Like somehow, you know, just somehow, some way it gets done. And I think that's in the legacy of the women who raised me. Like my mom did a lot, accomplished a lot. My grandmother, my sister. I just, you know, it's never an option for me to in any way push off any of the things I know have to be done. Like I have to be a mother. I have a little person that depends on me. You know, I have students that I love, that I want to see succeed. They depend on me. This getting a PhD is really like me. That's my selfish goal. I've known I wanted to do that since I was 16, and you know, I'm getting very, very close to finishing it. But also, again, like it's an endeavor that I know will hopefully, as stressful as it is, increase my quality of life, increase the quality of life of my children, my family. So, you know, I'm the things that I do, while it may seem a lot to other people, these are things that I love, that I'm completely and 100% dedicated to. So it doesn't always feel like work to me. These are things, you know, I love reading and researching and writing. I love being a mother. I love teaching. I love activism. You know, I love self-love and self-care. So these things they don't really feel like in any shape or form burdens to me. It's just, you know, it's just what I do.
Thank you, Celeste, and thanks, Stella, for the heads up. So now we're going to close, and Celeste, you want to take your turn now being the interviewer?
Oh my goodness, I'm so excited to introduce you. So everybody, welcome Christina Ong. She is a fourth-year PhD student. So Christina, can you just tell us a little bit about your podcast, some of the origin ideas that came about in producing this podcast, and if you'd like to share a small piece of it with us?
Yeah, great, thanks. Yeah, so as Celeste mentioned, I'm a fourth-year PhD student, and I started my podcast, Seats at the Table, the same year, in 2017. I think that's the year after Solange released her Seat at the Table album. And I had the idea for the name Seats at the Table for a while, and when Solange released her album, I was like, oh my God, I have to change it. But then I realized, oh, I have multiple seats and she just has the one. So I decided to keep it, and there was no other website with that name. So I thought, okay, well, it's fine. But the reason I decided to name my podcast Seats at the Table, and the whole idea around my podcast, was to learn about the activism and immigrant histories of women that I knew and admired, and also activist women that I didn't know, but maybe had some like loose ties to, and just to be more inspired by them and the work that they do. And something that I had been grappling with and still do, I think, is that in sort of a white supremacist society, there only ever seems to be room for one person of a minority group in like a larger setting. So there's only room for one Asian American researcher at an institution, only room for one Black woman at an institution to be successful. And I found that idea of scarcity to be so detrimental to my own ideas of how I could pursue my work and my own ideas of self. And so I said, okay, well, I don't want just one seat. I want multiple seats for multiple people, for there to be room for all of us to succeed. And so that's sort of the reason why I named it Seats at the Table. And it's still something that I think about today when I think about the competitive nature of a PhD program and how we're all, at a lot of times, pitted against each other for funding, for fellowships, etc. So I'm just going to set up sort of the clip that I'm going to play for you all. This is from 2018, so it's a little while ago. I'm now in my third season, so this is for my second season, and I'm in conversation with, her name's Christina Ong, and so we say we're name twins. We have very similar names. We're 2 letters off. And she's a comedian and a performance artist based in LA, and she does a lot of work with racial justice activism, and most recently she established what's called the Anti-Sewing Squad, which basically produced a bunch of masks in the very beginning of the pandemic, and now they produce masks for Native reservations, for healthcare workers, for anybody who's sort of at risk and needs more PPE, but they don't have the abilities to get that. So again, this is from 2018, so we don't talk about that. Right now, in the clip I'm about to play, she's going to be talking about a children's show that she produced and created called, well, I'll just play the clip and then you'll hear. So let me just share the screen and share my sound. Oh no. Sorry, I think it says it can't detect sound. So maybe I'm just gonna not play it. I don't want to waste everyone's time. So I won't play the clip. Sorry about that. But I'll link the website. So,
Okay, sounds good.
yeah.
I'll just wait a second for you to do that, and then we'll move forward.
Okay.
Okay, awesome. I see it's in the chat. So if you guys want to check out her the clip of the podcast, it's she put it in the chat for everybody to check out.
Yeah.
So can you just tell us a little bit about why you created your podcast?
Yeah. So essentially, I created the podcast because I knew I was applying to graduate programs and I had already applied, and I wanted to dip my toes into the water of like qualitative methods. And I thought, oh, a podcast will be like a very easy way for me to like practice interviewing skills, and it's just a podcast. Like, it's not YouTube editing. There's no video editing component. How hard could it be? So I sort of took the idea that like it's easier than video like editing, but it's harder than blogging. So I kind of wanted a middle ground, which it was like a falsehood. It was not true at all. And I also sort of wanted to feel more rooted in the community that I was living in before I left grad school. I just sort of wanted to be able to like communicate with more people. And so that's the main reason I created the podcast. And I thought it would be something that I could take with me into grad school and continue doing the podcast while I was in my first year of grad school, which I did not do that because of things we can talk about.
Okay. So just generally speaking, how did you make your podcast happen? Like, how did you make it really come together?
Yeah, so I did a lot of Google searching, which I think is what a lot of people do when they're thinking about starting a new project. And there were a lot of interesting people who gave me some good advice about like podcast hosting sites, microphone, like all the tech things that I had no idea about. And something that I really loved about podcasting and still love about it is that it has such a like low margin like of entrance. Like you really only need a microphone and an internet connection. I know people talk about you have to have good sound quality and all of that, but in order to like start and begin something, I feel like people should just do it. And then if they really enjoy it, then they can invest in the things that they need to improve that hobby. So as Minnie said, you can just use your phone to record interviews, and then you can just like put stuff on the internet, which could be not great, as we know, with like fake news. People could do it whatever they want, but that's sort of the way I started. And then I got a really low budget microphone, and I used GarageBand, which comes pre-installed on your Mac laptop to sort of edit. And I just played around with it and realized I really loved the podcast format and interviewing. So then I just spent more and more time doing that.
We've spoken about this, you and I, a little bit more in depth, but how have you been able to incorporate social justice themes into your podcast?
Yeah, my podcast is, since the focus is on examining the narratives of activist and immigrant women, it's sort of like rolled into the purpose of the podcast. But the main things that I do is that I made the conscious decision to focus on activist immigrant women, and then I as opposed to just activists or immigrants in general, just because I found that having the perspective of women in the world was not really present at the time when I started the podcast. Now there's a lot more of that happening, which I'm so thankful for. But at the time, I really felt that the people I was talking to, and I also worked in a refugee agency in Southern California, and a lot of the people making granting decisions and funding decisions were men, and people who also were not refugees and didn't know the experience of what it was like to be a refugee. Whereas the institution I worked for, it was a small nonprofit run by a former refugee woman who was from Ethiopia. So I really felt that voice, the voice of women themselves, the voices of refugees and immigrants themselves, needed to be present in the narrative, and that's sort of what drove my ideas forward.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's wonderful. So what processes do you use to select guests to be featured onto your podcast?
That's a little more difficult. I have a website, which is not linked right now, but I can link it again later. But I have like a contact form that people could contact me if they're interested in being a guest, or if they know somebody that they think would be a good person. And when I first launched the podcast, I was getting pretty good like responses from folks, but I think since I launched 3 years ago, not as many people use that form. And so then I started reaching out to people that I knew, like loose acquaintances. I actually feel like the best interviews I have are with people who are not my close friends and not complete strangers, but people who are in that sort of middle ground, who I think do really important work, but I actually don't know much about them or their story. And so I started reaching out to those like loose professional contacts. And that's sort of how I got a lot of my later interviews and later like stories that I posted.
Awesome. So this definitely relates to the next question, the final question that I have for you. You know, part of being a host is selecting guests and selecting the other people that come onto your podcast. Can you just kind of elaborate on what it's like being a podcast host and some of the different responsibilities that you feel that you have?
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, being a podcast host is a lot more difficult than I thought, and not just like a host, but I guess like a creator, a host, and an editor. Mindy talked about hiring a producer if you can afford that. I could not afford that. I still cannot afford that. So I had to pick up a lot of like skills on the fly, and I joke with my friends that my CV is so long it's because like my podcast made me like have all these skills that I didn't know I needed to develop at the time when I launched. So there's a lot of behind the scenes work that goes into podcast production, and I think that's the main reason why I don't push out as many episodes as I would want to, is the production. If I didn't have that, I think it'd be a lot easier. So if folks are thinking about starting podcasts, just like really try doing it, and then actually like time how much time that takes, because I would say like, oh, I would just double the time. Like if the interview is like 40 minutes, oh, it'd only take me like double that, 80 minutes. But in actuality, it takes like maybe 4 times that time to like edit and produce and package it, at least for me. So in terms of the work, the like easier work, I would do like pre-interviews, as Mindy mentioned, with my prospective guests. I've learned to not have to do that as much, especially if they're people that I like loosely know already. If they're complete strangers, then I do the pre-interview. And then, oh, should I wrap up? Okay, yeah. We in our small groups, I can talk more about process if people are interested in that. But yeah, thanks everybody.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Christina. Appreciate you so much. Let me mute myself again. Okay.
Thank you to both of you. That was really fascinating. And I love the fact that you were in some ways modeling how you interview people for your own podcasts, right? Or maybe you do something different, but you know, it was really, we got to learn a lot about you just in that process. So we're now going to move on to Celeste, Kemi, where are you? There you are.
Right
and
here.
me. Oh wait, sorry, what am I talking about? Not yet. Small groups. Whoops.
No, we're next.
What?
Yep, we come back afterwards. I see it. I was doing the same thing you did. I was like, oh, it's time for us, but it's after.
We're so anxious to talk. All right, so see you in a moment in our small groups, whatever they are.
Hi, folks. We've lost a few people, so we're just going to do 2 groups. So group 1 will be Celeste and Mindy, and then the next group 2 will be Kemi and Christina. And I'm going to send you all there now.
Okay.
I always feel like that's a Star Trek moment. It's a beam me up, Scotty.
Yeah.
Trent is our Scotty. Beam me up.
Unfortunately, my Scottish accent isn't great, so.
Lieutenant Uhuru. But did Sarah come back? I hope that, so in terms of the pre-interviewing question, I'll answer that more specifically, but yes, I have done pre-interviews with people. And then in the studio, we actually can get that sound right, and he does all the editing for me as well. But you too can do that on the different platforms that you might select.
So welcome back, everybody. We got a little sneak peek to what Kemi had to say, so that was fun. Yeah, I hope that you, I think there's always a little frustrating because there's so many questions people have, and it's really, our group was interesting. I'm sure yours was too. Celeste had an awful lot to say, more in depth about kind of the underpinning of what she's doing, and other folks had questions about kind of logistics. So, but we're now on to our next set of interviews. So I'm going to introduce Kemi, and then Kemi's going to introduce me, and then we'll just we'll move to the interview that I get to do with her, which I'm excited about. So Kemi's a PhD student in sociology at Texas Women's University, which you might recognize because that's also where Celeste is. She's studying the Black elite of the 18th century in the US. She's the mother of 4 daughters, and her king calf, Duchess?
Yes.
Yes. And she has a podcast that's going to be coming out, so we'll find out more about it, called Bulletproof Soul. It's a really interesting name, which I'm super intrigued by, which bridges communities through their cultural traditions of storytelling and music. Season 1 will explore how folk in Texas and beyond construct racial identity as resistance and social media occupation as social justice practice. So you want to introduce me, and then we'll dive into our interviews?
Yes, ma'am. Mindy Fried is the co-principal of Arbor Consulting Partners, a small consulting group based in Boston, Massachusetts. She's an applied sociologist with over 30 years of experience conducting research, teaching, and conducting policy analysis on organizational and workplace issues. In October of 2019, Mindy launched a new podcast about caregiving called The Shape of Care. She features caregivers and paid care workers, creators of innovative programs, and activists organizing nationally to mobilize care workers and implement a progressive national care agenda. In rapid response to the pandemic, she produced a special edition season of the podcast called Caregiving in the Time of Corona. The 11-episode special edition featured essential workers, program and policy experts, global perspectives on caregiving, care workers, and much more. The Shape of Care was featured in a New York Times article by Phoebe Lett and on public radio with an interview on WBUR's Radio Boston. It was also selected by WBUR as the producer's top episode for 2019. Hi, Mindy.
Hi, Celeste. So I got to start.
I'm Kemi.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I know you're Kemi.
KJP.
So Kemi, I have one really important question I got to ask you up front. I love the name of your podcast, and I got to know what that means. What is Bulletproof Soul?
So Bulletproof Soul represents the enduring spirit of humanity.
Mm. And how did that come to you? Can you just talk a little bit about, what your podcast is about and how your title reflects that?
Sure. So I was saying that I was being a rebellious PhD student, and my dissertation chair wanted me to apply for something that I didn't want to do, so because I didn't have time, and he thought it was a great idea. and he thought it was very innovative. And this is what happens when you raise your hand and give a comment. And he's like, yeah, let's do something with that. And I'm like, no, I don't have time. So I really just thought of the most extreme, elaborate idea that I could come up with. And I wrote this grant, and I really was being cheeky. I put everything in there, but the kitchen sink. And so I was really surprised when it got funded. And so the podcast is about exploring communities. I want to bridge, everybody talks about social justice, right? And about academy and how we have to produce behind these paywalled journal articles. And we put so much energy and effort and work and sacrifice into to developing scholarly content.
Yeah.
But nobody reads that stuff.
Right, right.
And then we're inundated with content. So all over. So my idea was based on my kids. They do podcasts all the time. They create YouTube videos and they create TikTok. And so I had this idea that we would create community online and that we would bridge the generations. And so it started with them. And that was, they would come together on their podcast with their friends and they would chop it up. And then I would come in, or another parent would come in with the mommy or the daddy or the, adult perspective. And so that was the framework for how I designed this podcast, but it was about surviving. And I realized that, folk are talking about agency, and, I come from a family of civil rights activists, and I do genealogy work. And so I wanted to put all of that in there. And so that's where the bulletproof souls, because you can shoot us, but you can't kill my spirit.
Oh,
you can
beautiful.
kill me. You can take out our leaders, but the movement still goes. And the tradition of oratory, of storytelling, had to move from community, because we're not gathering at the kitchen sink anymore. We're not gathering in the kitchen at the table anymore. And so all of that came together, and I was listening to Sade one day.
That inspired you, right?
Yeah, so it inspired me, and Bulletproof Soul was birthed.
Yeah. And so it was a really interesting evolution, because you got this grant and then you worked with your kids. So whatever spirit they brought to you in creating the podcast, I'm just wondering if some of what you learned when you were doing the work with them has influenced how you're approaching Bulletproof Soul.
Absolutely. They're the ones who taught me how to do this stuff, right? Because the technology, I'm old school. So this is more like talk radio. I think I was sharing with Trent yesterday, my first introduction to podcasts was growing up in the 70s, listening to W.E. Du Bois on spoken word on vinyl. Right? That's the first podcast. And that's one of the inspirations, is that W.E. Du Bois was more than just a social scientist. He was an innovator of technology. And so that's the other thing that the other element that I wanted to encompass into this was the research that I'm doing, but also kind of moving the academy forward, that scholarship is not just producing papers.
Yeah. Well, I'm really struck by, it's great that you have a university that is supporting your interest in having a public face to your academic work. So, I mean, on one hand, I sort of want to dive into well, who is your target? Are you really looking to speak to the academic community in a public sociology way, or are you moving beyond the academy and trying to reach folks in the community?
Definitely moving beyond the academy. So the way that the format is that I have both scholars enter into a banter conversation about with armchair sociologists and recliner politicians. And so they get a chance to chop it up, and then we get to say whether it's true or not, and kind of reframe and say, suggest how you might change your outlook. And so it has just been very interesting. I can't wait for the first release, but I'll give you a little anecdote in terms of racial categorization and this idea of racial fluidity. I've met several women in Texas who present as African American, but are categorized as white.
Hmm.
And so they talk about that and how, what's the benefit of, I was struck. I was, they're just real plain and raw. Like, what's the benefit of me saying that I have a Black son? On his driver's license, it says that he's white. I don't care what he looks like. On his driver's license, when the police pull him over, they look at his driver's license and they say it's white, then he's gonna come home. So it's very raw, but the other thing too is that I wanted to bring something that would unite us. There's a lot of discussion about how different we are, but when we have these conversations, it has been amazing to see how we're like this, like, oh wait, hold up. If we didn't have this forum and I hadn't brought my friends and my fellow academy folks, they would have never had a discussion and would have never known that they really do share very similar principles and ideas about living and loving and relaxing and laughing. So I try to, my other intention was, it's so intense. I wanted to have a way to laugh and share and develop relationships.
Mm-hmm. So since you're based in the university, do you feel any kind of pull or any obligation to do some kind of I mean, not now, but some in-person, like live podcast event or something like that?
Yes, so that is part of my grant. I am doing live stuff, and so we're doing, some of the episodes are Zoom calls.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
so what do you call that, Trent? You educated me yesterday, the vodcast. Those are the video podcasts where,
Oh, yeah, vodcast. Yeah.
yeah, so it's the vodcast, and then you have just the audio. So I have, and then I learned all kind of technical stuff. So my children were really moved me and kind of inspired me to take a dip in mobile devices and apps, as opposed to old school. I got to go into a studio. I got to sit with the producer and the engineer. That's very time consuming and costly. And so learning Anchor, a lot of angst behind that, but it's working.
Is Anchor is your editing tool?
No, Anchor is my host platform.
Oh, your host platform. Okay, got it.
And it pushes everything out. It's a one-stop shop.
Yeah.
It's very reasonably priced. But I got some best practices. Like on the first one, I was like, I can't find it. I don't know where it went. They're like, Mom, you should have just you should have pre-recorded it before and then you upload it to Anchor. They're 10 and 16.
Yeah. So it looks like we are closing in time, but I just want to, is there anything that you want to share with us about the meaning of doing this podcast for you personally?
The meaning of doing it. I did it anyway. I don't know what I'm doing. And I did it anyway, and I'm doing it my way. And I have the support in my community.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much. It's really an honor to interview you.
Okay, now it's my turn.
Uh-oh.
So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. You've heard a little bit about Mindy. I wanted to kind of deviate a little bit. Because it's a little dry and academic.
Yeah.
So I want to jump in. You've told us a little bit about what inspired you. You've produced an award-winning podcast. But what's something that people misunderstand about you in the podcast?
Oh. Well, okay, so here's something that just came up. I mean, I see myself as having kind of a radical, politically radical perspective that I'm bringing to it, as a feminist, as I mean, I would say probably as a socialist, as, you know, somebody who challenges systems. And so I'm now getting ready for the second season, and I'm really excited about it. There's 10 episodes, but the first 2 are going to be kind of are based in Connecticut. I found a facility that, you know, it's basically a nursing home. My cousin he was a filmmaker, did some work there, and so I've now I'm going to have, you know, interview a care worker and one of the women that she's worked with for many years, who's 94 years old, and really get into the relationships with them, and sort of, and then we'll get into issues around quality of, you know, models of care and so on. But I was talking to the CEO, and he said, you know, he's going to talk about models of care, and he said, is it okay if I tell people about, you know, that most nursing homes are for profit? Like, you know, sort of getting, do we want to bring this class issue, this issue of, you know, it's really an issue of capital. And it's like, yes, absolutely. That is, you know, central. I mean, I have infused the podcast with a social justice perspective, but for somebody who hasn't really listened to it in depth, they wouldn't necessarily know that. And caregiving is this issue that could be anything. I mean, there are other podcasts about caregiving that are very much, you know, social worker talking about her experience working with older people and the kind, you know, how we can support. I mean, it's just not, it doesn't get into like the nitty gritty of the power relationships, which I'm all about. So yeah.
Okay, that segues right into my next question.
Oh, okay.
Tell our audience about the interview that most touched your heart.
There's so many. Can I say 2?
Yes.
All right. I'm going to start out with a woman named Maria Colville. Maria comes from Trinidad and Tobago. She is a direct care worker. And she's also a member of a union, SEIU 1199. So she's part of an organizing group. Has a sense of politics, but also she's like so devoted to her job. She talked about being brought up in a small village in which her mother was like the village nurse, and that everybody came to their house was like the clinic. People came to her house, and that's how she got inspired to be a caregiver. And one thing she said was, you know, this was sort of early COVID that I interviewed her, and she said that she would die for this job.
Wow.
That took my breath away. I mean, that her level of commitment is so high that she would die for the job. So, you know, I think that oftentimes direct care workers are invisible in the equation. They tend to be women of color and immigrant women. And part of what I'm trying to do is elevate their voices and their experiences. And she blew me away. So I'll stop there because I know there's, you know, we have time issues.
Okay, how much time do we have left?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, good. Okay, you can tell your second one.
Okay. So the very first 7 episodes I did in a narrative style. So that I interviewed a whole bunch of people, and I had sort of approached this thing thinking that it was going to be focused on elder care, but as it turned out, my 2 main guests were women who were married to guys who, one was married to a guy who was declining, eventually died of Parkinson's, and the other is married to a woman who has Alzheimer's disease. So there's something incredibly powerful to follow those people over time. I've now interviewed each of them at least 3 times, and so they come back and to tell a different part of their story in the podcast. And so I'll just start with I just did a StoryCorps interview with this woman, Laura Barr. Laura's wife, Jean, has Alzheimer's. I knew her not really well. When I was going to start doing my podcast, I put the word out on Facebook that I was looking for people to interview about their caregiving stories. And I ran into her in a local park. She was with Jean, and she said, "Yeah, I've been meaning to contact you. I have a caregiving story." And I said, "Oh, wow, what is it?" And then she looked kind of, you know, very glanced at Jean, and she said, "Well, I can't really talk right now." And that my heart.
Oh, okay.
Okay, it was Jean. And at the time, Jean was starting to lose it. And the first episode with Laura, I did a visit to Rogerson House, which is where Jean had moved. It was like a memory care unit. And the first episode focused on how to maintain joy. And she had actually gone out, she was brought up like an RV family. She went out and got an RV, and she and Jean did all this traveling, blah, blah, blah. So I'm going to cut to the chase for time's purposes. When I did the StoryCorps interview, because obviously Jean had gone through all this process of eventually moving into a memory unit, then moving into a skilled nursing home, and now she's really not responsive at all. So, you know, along the way, I did an episode on homophobia and elder care. So that highlighted their lives.
That's very intriguing.
Issues, yeah. That was good. I interviewed her. I talked to a guy who started an LGBTQ elder care group that's doing all kinds of cool things. But anyway, cutting to the chase, the last interview that I did with Laura, she now, because Jean really is not responsive and doesn't know whether she's there or not, and it's all phone anyway, whatever. Laura's on the road. She's living in her RV. She's down in Florida. 2 minutes. She's got it set up so she can actually work out of her RV. But you know, she's also, you know, she's just not sure how long she's going to be gone. It was sort of the thing that she wanted to do for a really long time. And what's interesting is that she had kind of emotionally distanced herself, but being by herself in this RV and traveling like this has really gotten her back in touch with how much she really appreciated about Jean when Jean was Jean.
Right.
You know? So there's a lot of grieving that's going on through the process.
That being said,
yes.
To wrap it up, we got 2 minutes left. Share with the audience what you would pick for your last meal and what song you would have, or what song is the soundtrack of your life and your commitment.
So one thing I want you to understand about me is that I love music. I'm a musical person. I wake up in the morning thinking about a song, and oftentimes when I'm in a conversation, a song will come to mind.
I knew it. I knew that. I knew that about you.
Really?
So what song did you wake up to this morning?
So my daughter's a musician, and I love her voice. I love her music, and I woke up thinking about this song that she wrote called "In the Summertime," or in the summer. And she's got a really kind of smoky voice. She's not a smoker, but she's kind of got that, I don't know, it's just a very sensual, beautiful voice. So that was this morning. But, you know, I've been thinking about, I don't know, Stevie Wonder music is really coming to me these days. I'm sort of going back to some of the old stuff. Oh, I don't know, Emily King, I'm really loving her stuff. I don't know, I'm all over the place, and I play classical music not well on the piano, but so sometimes I'll have these like Bach pieces that I totally mess up.
Well, thank you, Mindy. You'll have to send me your annotated podcast with music list with those songs. Now I'll post them with our episode. So that's how I would wrap up mine. But thank you, Mindy. I enjoy speaking with you.
Yeah, I enjoyed speaking with you too. Take care. So, okay, so we're moving to the next piece, which is that we're going, as I said, rinse, repeat. So we're going to go into our next piece, which is another group. So.
That's right. We're going to do another 2 groups, but I've mixed up the leaders of those groups.
All right, cool.
All right, here we go. You'll have 15 minutes.
Hello.
Hi.
It sent me an invitation to go back to the main session.
Oh, weird. I wonder.
But I think it sent me back to the same room I was in first.
Yeah, I just switched Mindy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so you're good.
Okay.
How do I move you back?
Hey. Are we
We're
on?
back.
Yay. Trenton, we got a request for you. Kemi and I both forgot to make space for our audio clips. So I'm wondering if you could play them up front, and then we'll just open it up for some final questions if people have them.
You can play Mindy's.
No, play
Okay.
both of them.
No, because we had a plan. Trit and I had a plan and we're out of time.
Oh.
So
She
I'll
was
send the
gonna
link.
show off Anchor.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right.
So
Well,
Mindy, I'll share yours first.
okay.
I'm pulling it up. I had closed it, so 2 seconds.
Okay,
There we
you
go.
thought, oh, she missed her chance, right?
Okay. Here we go.
She really wanted to drive, but she just wanted the ability to know that she could drive. I think she was even a little bit worried about driving. And so she would put up a big stink about it. But what I did was gave her the key to the car that doesn't start the car. You have to have one that has a little chip in it to start the car. So I said, you know, here, you have the keys, whatever. And she never even tried. So I had been so worried about that conversation. But once I thought of that trick, it was just really not an issue after that.
Okay, so that was clip number 1.
Kemi, are you sure we can't show yours?
Yeah, I'm positive.
Oh, all right.
And here's number 2.
Once I kind of got further along in my arc of understanding what aging services were and how comprehensive and how really impressive they were in terms of their scope and their ability to actually keep people at home, I started wondering, what would this service be like for me as an out gay man?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the thing about audiograms is that they're really great marketing tools. You can use them in social media and whatever. So, so we have 5 minutes left, and Kemi, you should tell people how to see yours, or maybe send them out, or maybe put it in the chat room so people can.
Okay, I can do that.
That would be great. Does anybody have any final questions? This has been amazing. I have loved listening to my fellow speakers, and I've learned so much from all of you. And I'm really thankful to Trenton and Sela for all the work that you've done. So thank you so much to everybody.